Well, welcome, Paul and Jim. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to discuss your new book. Before we get into that, I thought maybe you could each give us both a brief background of your career experience.
Okay, well, mine started when I joined the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, known as UMIST, as a research assistant under Professor Des Winterbone. I don't think he was a professor when I joined, but he was when I left. Shows how long I was there. And I worked with him on IC engines, particularly a petrol engine. After I received my PhD, for which I was awarded the Richard Way Memorial Prize, and I believe one of your previous speakers, Phoenix Leach, was also awarded that prize. He was speaking to you probably about 2 years ago, and I think Amanda will probably confirm that.
Yeah, absolutely. We had him as a guest speaker. I think it was January 2022.
I should have waited a month. And then I moved briefly to the University of Bath to work for Frank Wallace, who's no longer with us, I'm afraid. Now, Frank at the time was an SAE fellow. My boss, Des Winterbone, didn't become an SAE fellow until a few years later, but we worked well together. And it was a short stay because I then moved to what was then called the Associated Octane Company Limited. Now it's Innospec Limited. And I moved with them to what was then called the Engine Technology Centre. It later became the Fuel Technology Centre. So that showed the way things were moving. And that was great for me because I was from an engine background, and that threw me into a fuels area. And previous to that, my understanding of petrol as we know it over here and gasoline as you know it over there was that petrol was petrol and maybe different octane numbers, but that was about it. Diesel fuel was diesel fuel. Working for Innospec, I realized that there was a lot more to these fuels than what I originally thought. And that greatly broadened my knowledge and incurred my interest more than anything else. And I then started working with CEC for Octal, and that again led me down the path of more about fuels and fuel technology, and in particular deposit forming mechanisms and ways to avoid that. I was working on various projects developing tests for the tendency of fuels to produce deposits. And that went on for some years before I diversified into fuel-borne catalysts, a way of promoting the regeneration of diesel particulate filters, which in those days were rather new, very new for production vehicles. So that led me into diesel emission control equipment and the various technologies associated with that. And then I moved up to Ellesmere Port with Octal and started working almost next door to Jim Barker, who's going to do his own introduction in a minute. And that proved very useful. And Jim and I produced a lot of SAE papers together. And that went on for probably about 6 years. I'll now hand over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I came into this business, if you like, this technology space in a slightly different way. I started off at Newcastle Polytechnic with an undergraduate career that produced 2 papers. Then I moved on to the University of Durham, working for Mel Kilner in platinum group chemistry and produced, again, a number of papers. I then went to work for Malcolm Walbridge, a senior research fellow at the University of Warwick. And where I was tempted by, again, as Paul says, the Associated Octal Company Limited, to come and work for them in a management position of the analytical group. The rest, I suppose, is history. Once you get the bug for fuels and the complexity of those, then there's no looking back. Since then, I've been a player at ASTM. I also head up the TMS panel at the Energy Institute in London, and as such, I've seen standardized methods through a number of areas in fuels. I also, as Paul has alluded to, became interested in the analytical chemistry of deposit formation within fuel systems, and have spent a number of years and produced a number of publications, some alongside with Paul and some alongside other authors, to understand and minimize the effect of those upon the engineering systems that were not designed, obviously, to take such problematic materials being present. So today I'm obviously trying to be involved in SAE. I'm heavily involved in ASTM and heavily involved in the Energy Institute in London. And I'm also a senior research fellow in Innospec Limited. Okay, that's me.
Okay, thank you both. All right, so let's get into the book. So your 4th edition of Automotive Fuels Reference Book was released last month. The 3rd edition was a best-selling reference in which, Paul, you were the sole author for. So for this newest edition, what motivated you to do it with a co-author? And then could you go into how it differs from previous editions?
Well, I suppose what motivated me in the first place was to do the 3rd edition. And the motivation for that, I suppose you could say, was my father, Bernard Richards. Now, he's not a mechanical engineer, but he was good for motivation. Check him out on Wikipedia. Someone's been motivated enough to give him a page on Wikipedia, so give that a going over. But yeah, my father motivated me because he didn't just father an inquisitive mind, he fostered it and always encouraged me to inquire further. So that was the motivation in a way. And when I said I was retiring, his lip quivered a bit and said, well, what are you going to do now? I said, well, there's always the SAE activities. And I suppose that was the motivation for doing the 3rd book. And now I was asked to do the 4th edition. I was a bit hesitant at first, but I thought, well, maybe with a bit of assistance. And as Jim says, we've authored a few papers together. So the inspiration for doing the 4th edition was to work with Jim and put our minds together and our pens together, if you like, to produce an update on the 3rd edition. So that was how that one came about. Now, I think the major difference is that things moved in the 10 years since the 3rd edition. And one of those big changes we might come on to later was the change in environmental concerns and the legislation to move towards more sustainable fuel developments. So that was the motivation behind what brought us to where we are now.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So your book intertwines discussions on automotive fuels, fuel additives, and engines. Can you explain the significance of addressing these topics collectively and share insights into how you structured the content to make it comprehensible for readers?
Well, I think the incentive to twist them together, if you like, or to put them in one volume rather than 3 separate volumes, is that they are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. They're all interrelated. And I think the big drive to put them all in one book is to make everyone aware that they are interrelated. You can't have one without the other. Now, as regards the structure of the book, because it was the 3rd edition, there were 2 more before it, I tended to follow the way it started off. And we start off with a couple of chapters which are basically an introduction and history to automotive fuels, which basically boils down to gasoline and diesel fuel. So the first 2 chapters are background and history on that. The next 3 chapters delve into how you make these fuels. Now, the first of those 3 chapters is making it from crude oil, which is what most people did back in the days that Keith and Trevor wrote the 1st and 2nd editions. We then move on to alternative fossil-based fuels, which people were moving into. The 1st and 2nd editions were put out, but that's grown now, and we've got gaseous fuels and fuel made from gas to liquid fuels, and even made from coal, because not everyone had access to the oil in those days. So people were making these fuels from coal as well. But then probably more importantly nowadays is to make it from renewable sources. So we've got 3 chapters showing you how the fuels are made. The 6th chapter looks how to handle these fuels once you've made them, how to transport them and store them, etc. And then the book sort of splits up into gasoline and diesel fuel. So there's 7 chapters on each of these 2 types of fuels, or broadly categorized as 2 types of fuels. And each of those groups of 7 start off with a couple of chapters for each fuel on how these fuels are burnt, what's the combustion process, what's the history of the engine technology to burn these fuels. And there's a chapter on racing fuels in particular, which is basically gasoline. So that makes effectively 8 chapters on gasoline, 7 on diesel fuel. And for anyone that's been keeping track, that takes us up to 21 chapters. There's then a chapter on where we're going now in terms of engine technology, what people are looking at, particularly for low temperature combustion to reduce the emissions from the combustion engine. And then the final chapter is basically crystal ball stuff, looking forward as to where we might be in the next 10, 15 years, and what technologies, fuels are going to be around when we get there. So that was how I structured it, which, as I say, was the same as the 3rd book, and that's where we stuck.
Yeah, I think Paul sums it up very well in that the vistas of technology, be it fuel or be it engines, is changing dramatically over the last 10 years. Those things, I'd echo the fact that, you know, we need textbooks that you can put on a shelf and take off when something comes to mind or comes up in a paper that can give you a base start, albeit like any textbook, it goes out of date fairly rapidly, but nevertheless will give you a base start. A go-to situation is important in textbook, be it in inorganic chemistry, organic chemistry, or engineering. These are the fundamentals that we hoped, if we put them in the book, would serve the industry well in the future.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and you kind of answered my next question, so I'll move on, because you kind of elaborated on how your book goes through the whole history in the first couple of chapters of how everything has changed in the industry as far as fuels are concerned. So for professionals working with automotive engines, how does the knowledge presented in your book translate into practical applications and improvements in their work? So for example, can you share any particular case studies where the information from your book has been applied to achieve tangible results?
I don't think I can share case studies as such, but I think the book tries to show that the things are integrated, and that as an engineer, you're not stuck with just simply changing the nuts and bolts and the hardware, changing the metals you use, etc. The fuel is an integral part of the system, and you've got to appreciate that in order to see what you can change and what you can't change. And a good example might be fuel additives. Fuel additives, as we say, are integrated into this system. And a good example of that was going back probably over 20 years now. PSA introduced the first commercially available diesel particulate filter system. Now that relied on a fuel-borne catalyst to help regenerate that filter and stop you clogging up the exhaust after 100, 200 miles. And that wasn't part of fuels in those days. And so they got round it by injecting it into the fuel tank when the fuel tank was filled. So it was an engineering solution to changing the fuel, which people hadn't thought of before. And so that's integrating the different technologies to produce a vehicle that became very commercial. So it's not, I won't quote that as a case example, but it's an indication of how knowledge of the different aspects of the system, fuel, the fuel additives, and the engine hardware can be integrated to great advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can come in there, Paul, you know, we've only seen recently the influence of deposit control additives with gasoline direct injection engines causing significant reduction in particulates, which is, of course, described in the book. That has real life, real term medical implications for our quality of our air. And that's the kind of thing that we hope we've captured, but that hopefully will spur on, you know, new innovations and new ideas. But you've got to start from somewhere. And we you know, if we want a message to go through this, if you have the book to hand on your desk or on your laptop, it allows you to delve into there for the historical background and the latest thing to date. And then that can spur you on to more research, more investigations, and hopefully move things further on in the technological space that we inhabit.
Great, thank you. Okay, did you come across any particular major challenges when researching or writing the newest edition of this book?
As regards research, I think the major challenge was where to stop. I mean, Mobilis is a great resource, and SAE papers that result from it are a great resource. And you can very easily be led off down a path that's of great interest, but not necessarily of direct relevance to the book you're writing. So that in a way was the challenge as regards research, is where to stop. As regards writing the book, or typing the book as it is these days, I don't think anyone writes anything, but I think the major problem we came across was that, I mean, the third edition was 868 pages. Now, it's a reasonable sized book, not just in terms of number of pages, but in terms of the format. It was a 7 by 10 inch format. Now, the first edition was only 694 pages. Second edition was 972 pages. So it had grown 40%. Now, they were slightly smaller books. They were only 6 by 9 format. So it grown 40% between first and second. It grew another 15% between second and third. Now, SAE, bless their socks, wanted a limit of 1,000 pages for the fourth edition. So that sounded a bit of a challenge in the first place. And as it turned out, we probably put the number of pages up by 12% and the number of figures up by another 5%. So it was getting very close to our limit. But thanks to a bit of creative thinking by Amanda and Sherry, we got that in at only 802 pages for the fourth edition.
Yeah, I think Paul's correct. The discipline is what to leave out. It's always difficult in this case, but hopefully we've captured the most important salient points in the book.
Excellent. Okay, I know you kind of briefly touched on this earlier, Paul, but given the increased emphasis on minimizing emissions, especially with stricter regulations that are existing today compared to when you wrote the third edition, can you elaborate a little bit more on how your book addresses the environmental effects of automotive fuels and combustion systems?
Well, I think the book is a reference book, so it's more a question of documenting what's out there rather than trying to guide people along a particular path. One of the problems we found when doing the fourth edition was in Europe, the regulations, although they've been proposed, they've not been formalised. So the limits are tentative in the book, which is a bit of a shame. But I think what we've tried to do is show what technology is out there. One of the big changes is the introduction of particulate filters on gasoline engines. But the other thing is the overall carbon balance of producing the fuel and producing the engines that ingest that fuel and use that fuel. And the earlier chapters on the fuel technology are addressing that, and rather than the emissions control technology.
Yeah, I think Paul's right. The emphasis on emissions is absolutely correct and cannot be overemphasized. But the key to that is back in the engine manifolds, the way that works, and in the fuels, and understanding them is key to moving forward to reduced emissions. And the IC engine, when you work out how many there are worldwide, and the distribution worldwide is not going to disappear for many years, and it is clearly a mission amongst those involved in the automotive and the fuel industry to try and minimize any emissions that are occurring by means that we have now, and that means that hopefully the original ideas in the book will spare on to new and better ideas to deliver that emission reduction and allow the IC engine to work over the period that it's allowed politically to minimize the effect that it's having.
Absolutely. Okay, that kind of leads into my next question. Despite the increasing popularity and use of electric vehicles, it is clear that the internal combustion engines will continue to play a significant role. Looking ahead to the next 5 to 10 years, how do you envision the automotive industry advancing towards more sustainable fuel and environmental friendly solutions?
Well, I think we've already touched on the major path, which is the environmentally friendly fuels, which is reducing CO2 emissions, or the net CO2 emissions, and changing where you create what you create your fuel from is a major source of that. You can generate it from bioproducts, either directly bioethanol or biodiesel. You can also do it by hydrogenating those products, HVO, to produce renewable fuels. And people are already producing refineries that will do that. It's mentioned in chapter 5 of the book, I think. And that's making a big difference to what is potentially available for the IC engine. The other thing is the e-fuels, which we briefly touched on, where you can use the electricity from renewable sources, and I stress that it's got to be a renewable source, otherwise it doesn't make any difference. But you can use that renewable electricity to generate hydrocarbon fuels, and you can do that by extracting the carbon from the CO2 and combine that with hydrogen abstracted from water, and put those back into combination to produce hydrocarbon fuels. So when you burn that hydrocarbon fuel, you're just putting the CO2 back into the atmosphere from which you've grabbed it in the first place. Now, that's small scale at the moment, and it's very expensive, but it's possible. And again, that's noted in the book. There are plants coming on stream now that can do that. So that will make them environmentally friendly in the sense that they're CO2 neutral, but they're also environmentally friendly in that they reduce the emissions that's going into the atmosphere. And we're hearing quite recently about the amount of poisonous gases that are put into the atmosphere by flaring off from fossil fuel production. So that's at the source, but as regards the environment, it's not just a question of CO2, it's the air we breathe that's got to be clean and not going to kill you off by putting particulates into your lung. As Jim has mentioned a couple of times, keeping the particulate emissions from these IC engines low or negligible is very important for the environment that we live in. It's not just a question of CO2, it's other things that are in there. and keeping the engine clean so that it doesn't produce noxious particles is also very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'd echo exactly what Paul has just said. You know, BEVs are not without issue. Nothing that we do to this planet is without issue. We just have to work everything in a better way, and thus, you know, keep emissions and find different ways, different fuels to enable the planet to still sustain itself from agricultural and automotive points of view. It is a very, very complex problem. And certainly SAE over their recent powertrain conferences have addressed that problem significantly with life cycle analysis, and hopefully that will be something that will guide us as we move forward in this technological space.
Yes, going back a couple of years, as we've just mentioned, Phoenix Leach was on this spot January 2022, I think you said, Amanda. And he was introducing a book called Racing Towards Zero. And that book outlines the fact that electric vehicles aren't exactly pollution-free.
Indeed.
They may not produce any tailpipe emissions because they don't have a tailpipe, but they're not pollution-free.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, you've done such a fantastic job outlining the book, all of the content, how it's organized. Is there any key takeaways or messages that you hope that your readers take with them as they finish your book? Anything that we haven't already discussed?
Hopefully not that we've already discussed, but as I say, I think the key takeaway is that fuels, fuel additives and engines are all interconnected. You can't have one without the other, and you can't develop one without the other. You've got to develop them together with knowledge of all three, and the book is an ideal source generator for passing that knowledge on.
I think from my point of view, I would hope that once they've either delved into it in a small chapter way or in a moment of lunacy read the whole book, as some people do read textbooks, that the reader goes away with it, with ideas of where we are now and where they feel they can move innovation forward in the future. And if it does that, and then it allows them to come back at a future time in a different area and to take something from the book and move forward innovation-wise again, I think then the book will have done its job.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we do have one question from the chat from Sherry. She wants to know what book you'll be writing next.
I think Paul and I have gems of ideas, but that's where they are at the moment. But we will obviously keep SE informed when we do.
Yes, as I said, the 1,000 pages proved a challenge that wasn't as much of a challenge as we thought. There's definitely more out there that we discuss that can either expand a 5th edition or generate a new book in its own right. So watch this space, as they say.
Exactly.
That's great. Yes. And actually, I know you both mentioned that you both are involved in various aspects of SAE. Do you have any other future projects, not necessarily a book, that you're thinking about or working on?
Well, I'm still reviewing papers. I'm just about finished reviewing papers for next year's WCX. So I think that's hopefully going to keep me occupied for a while yet. But I'm not embarking on anything too great at the moment.
I think I'm doing the same as Paul. I'm reviewing papers. I do have a gem of an idea for something in the future for one of the conferences, but at the moment it's just a gem of an idea. But hopefully we'll get it to fruition in good time.
Okay. Well, we do have a little bit of time left before we turn it back over to Shane. Do you have any final thoughts or comments that you would like to leave the audience with?
There's nothing springs to mind at the moment other than go out and buy a copy of the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Times are hard in the UK. No, seriously, I think, if you've got a set of textbooks on your shelf, which I'm sure most of you have, of key go-to textbooks, and I know I have quite a few students and they all have copies of this to hand. It's important as a base in many areas to get you started. And then once you start, I'm sure that the thought process will drive you to something very useful for the industry. That's all I would hope for.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much again for volunteering your time today. This has been an excellent conversation. And of course, we do encourage everyone to get their own copy of the book. So thank you again. We can turn it back over to Shane, and happy holidays.